Well, good afternoon, everyone, and glad you could join us today for the Diversity and Leadership webinar, the 50-30 Challenge. My name is Louis De Palma. I'm the Vice President of SME Programs at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce acknowledges the work that we do takes place on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our regional hubs and partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. Today in this webinar, we will explore why diversity in leadership matters and how to increase diversity in your organization's boards and leadership. This session will address the status of board diversity, why diversity in leadership matters, voluntary codes, and the way to move forward. I'd like to introduce the first speaker and presenter, Nancy Mitchell. She is the Senior Manager at the Diversity Institute. Over to you, Nancy.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having us. Great to be back to speak to you all. So I will just share my screen. Give me a second. Okay, amazing. So today we're going to be speaking out about diversity and leadership, particularly on boards and in the senior leadership roles across Canada. So the agenda is we'll share a little bit about the Diversity Institute, some context, so disparities that exist in representational levels of women and equity deserving groups across Canadian boards and in leadership roles, as well as on boards of different sectors and in different cities. And then we'll pivot and talk about the way forward. So some strategies and solutions that you all can take and adopt into your organizations to support board diversity and inclusion. And within that, we'll talk about a specific strategy or a specific challenge, the 50-30 challenge. So a little bit about the Diversity Institute. We were founded in 1999. We have over 100 full-time researchers and staff and over 250 industry community partners. We're focused on really supporting businesses and organizations of all types and sizes and sectors in embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion thinking and goals within their organizational processes and structures. So we really aim to provide organizations with the strategies and the resources and tools to foster change in their organizations, and a lot of times really geared to the context in which they're in. We support large organizations, but we also support small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as organizations that are quite small, so even less than 10 people. So that's a little bit about us. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion at the leadership level, I always think it's so important to start with understanding the data, because the quantitative data really does reveal disparities that exist at the highest level. And tons of data exists, but I do want to highlight a specific study that was conducted by the Diversity Institute. It's our unique study, the Diversity Lead Study. And it was done with just under 10,000 board members across sectors in Canada. So across corporate boards, voluntary boards, education, hospitals, and ABCs. It was conducted across 8 major cities in Canada. So Vancouver, Calgary, London, Ottawa, Hamilton, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. And it looked at the representation of a couple of groups. So women, racialized people, and Black individuals. And I think the findings are stark in many cases. When we look at the data, we see that there are big disparities that exist in the percent of individuals in the population versus their representation on board levels. And I'll highlight a couple. So when we're looking at Toronto, for example, we see that women make up about 51% of the population, but they hold about 38.9, so 39% of board roles. When we're looking at Hamilton, we see that they make up over half of the population, just over half, but they represent about 42.3% of board roles. And then when we look at Calgary, we see that women make up 50% of the population, but 33.7% of board roles. So disparities in the percent of population versus actual representation on boards. And then when we look at racialized individuals, we also see stark disparities, particularly for Toronto and Vancouver. So in Toronto, racialized individuals make up just over half of the population, but they represent about 15.5% of board roles. And then in Vancouver, racialized individuals make just under half of the population, but about 12.3% of board roles. And then the study dug even deeper into different racialized communities and looked at the representation of Black individuals on boards. And we found that in Toronto in particular, you see that Black individuals make up 7.5% of the population, but they hold only 3.6% of board roles. We know that disparities are not equal across all different types of boards. And so the study looked at, like I said, corporate boards, hospitals, municipal ABCs, provincial ABCs. And what we found is that corporate boards seem to have some real disparities in representation. So if we look at the representation of racialized people across corporate boards, we see that they make up about 4.5%, and then women about 25.3%. But if you're comparing this to voluntary boards, for example, the representation of racialized people is higher, 11.6%, and so is the representation of women, about 43.1%. So I do want to just highlight that we see disparities on the whole, but we do see disparities across different cities in Canada and across different types of boards. And in a little bit, I will highlight some of the barriers that I think exist and that were revealed in the study for individuals actually accessing corporate board roles. But I do think that these statistics in this study in particular does highlight some of the high-level disparities. We also know that people are multifaceted and people come to, life, the workplace, et cetera, with different lived experiences. So the identities of racialized people and the identities of people of different gender identities are not mutually exclusive. Myself, for example, I'm a racialized woman. And so when we're thinking about diversity at the leadership level, it's really important to think about intersectionality and the recognition that people have different lived experiences and may experience different forms of oppression that are compounding and that create unique experiences for them. And so our study did apply an intersectional lens. And what we found is that non-racialized women tend to outnumber racialized women across cities in Canada within the study. So if you look at Halifax, the rate of non-racialized women to racialized women on boards was 3-1 and Montreal 12-1. So applying this lens does reveal even more granular disparities that we can see. In addition to understanding the quantitative data, so the statistics, it's really important for us to also understand some of the stories that can be revealed in the qualitative side, because I think it's another part of the coin. We're seeing diversity and disparities that exist in representation at the leadership level, but we also need to understand workplace inclusion, whether people are respected and valued within their actual role at the leadership level. So what the Diversity Lead study did was they surveyed about 36 board members across Canada, and we found some barriers that exist across the main themes highlighted on the slide, and I'll give a little bit more context and understanding. So we found that many participants feel that corporate boards are less welcoming and found that spaces that lacked diversity really reflected this in the organization's culture. So again, that does link to the quantitative findings I presented earlier of lower levels of representation within corporate boards. We also see that there's a heavy emphasis on executive corporate experience. And this is another barrier in people actually accessing particularly corporate boards, because we see that many of the individuals surveyed expressed that, there are other valuable skill sets that people can bring to the table, but these often are undervalued compared to just general executive corporate experience. Many individuals who were interviewed who identified as Indigenous or people living with disabilities or members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community mentioned that they had experienced discrimination throughout their careers and throughout their career life cycle that made it really difficult as well to get into leadership roles and to navigate finding positions or seeking positions on board roles. And then I think coupled with this, we found that many respondents indicated that there's a culture of silence where the environment isn't welcoming or doesn't feel welcoming. And as a result, people feel like they can't bring their whole authentic self to the workplace. And if you think about that, that only further compounds issues and barriers, because if I'm an individual with a disability, for example, and I feel that I'm not able to bring my full authentic self to the workplace, given discrimination, stigma, bias, etc., I may not be seeking the accommodations that I need to be my authentic self, to perform at my job, etc., and to bring my full skill set to the role. And how does that further create barriers for me, right? And so this culture of silence actually does keep people down, and it keeps people from seeking board roles. And then, of course, people mentioned a lack of formal networks and a lack of mentorship and sponsorship. So we know that oftentimes board recruitment relies on informal networks and lack of streamlined and centralized approaches. But how are biases embedded within the outreach process itself? And how does that translate into the informal processes we have? So I do think we can also see reports, studies, news reports, for example, that show that individuals do experience a lack of workplace inclusion, whether that's studies that show that individuals, and particularly racialized individuals, tend to change their resume so that it reflects what they think the organization or the board is looking for. We see that people of different religions maybe don't share that they, pray on a certain day, or they don't drink alcohol at the function and they feel like they need to hide that part of their identity. We see people not bringing, like I said, their full authentic self to the workplace, parents who maybe can't attend board meetings because it's after hours and they have other responsibilities, or people with other caregiving responsibilities. And so overall, there are disparities that exist in the representation, but this is coupled with a lack of inclusive workplace culture that make people feel like they're not respected and that they can't be themselves. So how can we mitigate barriers, and really what is the way forward? What are some of the strategies that we can adopt? And I think when we're thinking about strategies, it's helpful to think about the ecological approach to change. And what this is really looking at is the different levels in which barriers exist, but also the different levels in which you can find solutions and strategies for change. So we're thinking about the societal level, the organizational level, and the individual level. And what I do want to highlight is that all of these different levels support one another and they feed into one another. And so hopefully, if you're making positive change at the societal level, this is making positive change also at the organizational level and the individual level, and then trickles back, kind of like a cycle. That's how I think about it. So at the societal level, here we're really thinking about broader phenomenons or broader processes. So something like the media and the portrayals that the media puts out, the biases that are embedded in the media we consume, et cetera. But we're also thinking about government initiatives, government policies. And so I'll highlight a couple because I think it's important. If you think about government policies and processes related to childcare and parental leave, what this is really signaling is when the government puts in place policies related to inclusive parental leave or accessible childcare, it's a signal that there's a recognition of the importance to support families, a recognition of different types and structures of families, and an acknowledgement that childcare does not solely fall on one individual, typically mothers, right? So if you have inclusive childcare and inclusive parental leave policies at the government level, this is signaling kind of what's important, and it can trickle down into the kind of policies that are adopted by organizations. When the government puts in place policies related to housing and education, they're mitigating barriers that are baked into structures and systems. And then I think in recent years, we've seen the government put in place not only legislation related to employment equity, but also voluntary codes to encourage organizations to prioritize diversity and inclusion at the board and at the leadership level. So on this slide, I pulled together different legislation and codes. So we see that in Canada, we have employment equity, we have pay equity legislation. We also have Bill C-25, which requires federally incorporated companies to report on the representation of the designated groups at a minimum. So women, racialized individuals, Indigenous peoples, and people living with disabilities. And Bill C-25 is really positioning Canada as a global leader in addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and also promoting transparency and accountability for organizations. And then in recent years, we've also seen voluntary codes springing up. So things like the 50-30 challenge, 30% club, Black North, and I'll talk a little bit more about these. So I think that organizations, but also initiatives like voluntary codes are really important for bringing the ecosystem together under specific pledges or specific actions for change, and then really fostering communities where best practices can be shared. So a couple of examples of voluntary codes, like I said, Black North, with a mission to remove anti-Black racism and barriers related to, or systemic barriers that impact Black Canadians. The Responsible Investment Association, which has a mission to integrate diversity and inclusion into investment processes within Canadian companies. And then the 30% Club, and we're lucky because we do have the country lead for Canada, Jennifer Laidlaw, on the line. So the 30% Club mission is to improve the representation of women in leadership and senior management roles to 30%. Another voluntary code that I do want to speak to is the 50-30 challenge. And this was adopted by the Government of Canada in recent years in partnership with organizations across the ecosystem in Canada. The challenge, like I mentioned, is voluntary, and it really encourages organizations to strive towards two goals. So the first is gender parity, which is 50% women and or non-binary people on boards and or in senior leadership roles. And then significant representation of equity deserving groups, so 30% on Canadian boards and or in senior management roles. And then the equity deserving groups outlined by the government and present in the challenge are Indigenous peoples, racialized individuals, people living with disabilities, and members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. I think something that's really unique and attainable and aspirational about the challenge is this and or piece. And it often gets lost because it's sometimes just considered semantics. But if we look at the goals, so gender parity and significant representation on boards and or in senior management, this is really providing flexibility to organizations that have all different governance structures or types. So some organizations may just be starting out. You may be an SME and you don't have a board yet, but you can still aspire to the challenge because you can be meeting the goal in your senior leadership. Some organizations have different structures for their senior leadership. And so this and or piece, like I said, small, but actually provides a lot of organizations flexibility so they can still aspire to the challenge or still work towards its goals. And then something I'll also say I think is really unique and important about the challenge goes back to what I said about intersectionality. So the challenge recognizes that goals are actually not mutually exclusive. And so when you're striving towards the challenge, let's say you had a board of 10 individuals, 5 are women and or non-binary people, and then 3 come from equity deserving groups. You've effectively met the challenge because the challenge is not asking people to fit into neat boxes. It recognizes that people are multifaceted. I do want to highlight how the challenge publicly available specification and some of the terminology and the definitions that form part of the challenge came to be. So the Diversity Institute conducted a wide-scale consultation process with over 400 organizations across different types and sectors in both English and French across Canada to really understand the different definitions and terminology that forms part of the challenge. And if you're interested in reading a little bit more about challenge goals, definitions, and more of the fine print, I'm happy to post a link to the publicly available specification in the chat. So I do want to speak about the challenge's reach and also its impact. I think to date we have over 1,800 signatories across Canada, which is great. And signatories are of all types and sizes. So we have large corporations, but also small and medium-sized enterprises, and then organizations of different types and sectors. So you have post-secondary institutions, nonprofits, ABCs, and others. And then what I'll say is there are two types of organizations. There are those that already meet the challenge and are going beyond the goals. And there are organizations that are aspiring to the challenge and that are using the tools and supports that are available to them through the challenge to really get to where they need to be to reach the goals. And then, like I mentioned, the challenge is voluntary, but we do have a number of tools, supports, and resources that organizations, once they sign on, can use, whether that's a toolkit, whether it's customized training, et cetera, to really support your goals and to also foster an inclusive workplace culture. There is reporting and implementation baked into the challenge, and this is because we recognize it's important to foster transparency and accountability, especially for voluntary challenges. And so the expectation is that organizations will report on their efforts towards challenge goals within their regular monitoring and reporting structures. So if you're an organization that has an annual report, you'll put your progress towards your EDI goals and towards the challenge goals in that. If you have a newsletter that goes out regularly and you put it in that, it depends on the kind of structure that you use, how often you do your public reporting, et cetera. So in addition to the 50-30 challenge, I want to share a couple of other strategies and tools that organizations of all sizes can use to really enhance diversity, but also workplace inclusion on boards and in senior management roles. And when we talk about strategies and tools for change, I think it's so important to recognize a whole of organization approach. So we're talking about leadership and governance and the tone that leadership sets from the top. We're talking about HR practices. So this is your recruitment, your promotion, your retention strategies. We're talking about your culture and your values, the way that people speak to one another, the events you hold, who talks in meetings, who takes notes in meetings, the little things that often sometimes get glossed over, but actually really impact how people feel in an organization. Your diversity across the value chain. So thinking about your product design, your marketing, your procurement strategies, the vendors you select, for example. And then also outreach and expanding the pool, how you engage with the local community and local community organizations. And then underpinning all of this is measurement and tracking, looking at the kind of efforts that you're undertaking, the progress that's been made, and also the opportunities that exist for future efforts. So when we talk about leadership and governance, we're really talking about tone from the top and, the board or the leadership really recognizing that EDI is a priority for them, setting an intention towards diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, promoting this internally, but also externally. And I think a key component of that is building a strategy that really bakes EDI within your existing growth or your existing corporate strategy. So leaders can really develop a strategy that embeds goals within their current efforts and then monitors these on a regular basis. Something that I also find is helpful is diversity assessments across the organization, really understanding a baseline of your current representation, the current diversity you have throughout the organization, but also at the leadership level, as well as people's perceptions of whether the workplace feels inclusive, and then monitoring this on an ongoing basis to see if you've improved and what future areas exist for improvement. And then there's tons of different strategies and solutions that exist for actually recruiting the board, retaining individuals on the board, and so forth. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But I do want to highlight that leadership also has an opportunity to really challenge assumptions about skills. And this goes back to what we said about barriers for individuals obtaining corporate board roles, really understanding the kind of skills and the kind of experience that you need for your board, rather than just going with, what's always been done. Are you actually looking for individuals that have corporate experience, or are there different skills and experiences that would bring more diversity to your board, refreshed perspectives and solutions to your board? So here are some good and best practices that we pulled onto the screen that I think can really help organizations in diversifying the board and the senior leadership. So a skills matrix to assess qualifications of board members and senior leaders, which includes specific diversity characteristics. And again, this goes back to what I said about what kind of experience you're going to value or recruit. guidelines and specialized mandatory training for board members, so that everyone kind of has similar expectations and understandings of EDI and why it's important. Term and tenure limits for directors to ensure that there's turnover, as well as succession planning. You can even have a diversity lead or a committee that's responsible for this, in addition to the strategy that you're baking into your corporate strategy and your growth strategy. A board nomination committee, and then a strategy for recruitment, onboarding, and mentoring, promoting, etc. And what I think all of these practices have in common is some sort of effort to streamline and formalize and plan for how you're embedding EDI on your board and how you're having individuals and all their diversity, on the board and in senior leadership. And then a couple of strategies for recruiting board members. And I think this really boils down to outreach methods and tapping into the pool. Sometimes we hear from organizations that they weren't able to find, an individual, a woman for their board, a racialized individual for their board. But it's not that these people don't exist. It's that we're not tapping into different networks or diversifying our outreach strategies. So working with local organizations or communities to identify different members of the board, considering hiring firms, for example, and making connections with organizations that support different equity deserving groups, right? So sometimes it's kind of about your outreach strategies and how you can diversify these. I think, like I mentioned, something that's really key is whether the board or the leadership team feels inclusive. So you've done all the efforts to recruit people, get people in the door, but do people want to stay? And do people feel like their perspectives are valued when they come onto the leadership team or onto the board? Something that I think we can really be mitigating is conformity bias and groupthink. So when we're at a board meeting and we're all finding solutions to a problem, do people feel pressured to select option A over option B because they feel like it wouldn't be the best to speak out or to speak up, right? And so you want to make sure that your board feels like they can take risks and they can feel comfortable sharing their perspectives. You want to make sure that everyone's involved in the planning. So when you're having meetings, does everyone have an opportunity to say, hey, Friday works for me. Friday doesn't really work for me. I have XYZ. Are people present and consulted when you're planning meetings, when you're planning solutions, etc.? Is everyone's voice heard, like I mentioned? Are you rotating roles at every meeting? Something as small as who always takes notes at the meeting can make people feel alienated, can make people feel like their role is something specific compared to other people's. So just be mindful of these little things that are actually big things and impact how people feel. Respectfully drawing out diverse perspectives, and then making materials available to everyone. And then we've done the societal level, the organizational level, and then just at the individual level, I think each of us has a responsibility to model the inclusive behaviors that we want to see and recognizing our own spheres of influence to create change. So this is something like understanding effective strategies for allyship, creating an inclusive environment, taking training, for example, or broadening your horizons through educational efforts, recognizing microaggressions. And I'm happy to pop some resources related to this in the chat, but recognizing microaggressions and how you can mitigate bias in day-to-day interactions. Being a mentor for someone. So if you've had a fabulous experience on a board and you have some tips and tricks, sharing that with others so that these opportunities are more widely available. So we've gone through strategies that relate to societal level. We've talked about the 50-30 challenge. We've gone into organizational efforts, and we're ending on the individual level. And at this point, we do have some panelists here who are going to speak a little bit more to the 50-30 challenge. So I will invite them to pop their camera on. We have Jennifer Laidlaw, like I mentioned, who is the head of the 30% Club of Canada. We have Shara Roy, who is the Chief Legal Counsel at EY Canada. And then we have Sanjana Vijayan, the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. So welcome to our panelists. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think I'll start off by giving everyone an opportunity to introduce yourself, your work, and your organization. And maybe we can start with Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great overview. Hello, everyone. I'm the country head of the 30% Club in Canada, and it's a campaign that started in the UK in 2010. It's now in all of the G20 countries, and it aims for a floor, not a ceiling, but a floor of 30% women on boards and in C-suites. And we have teamed up with the 50-30 Challenge and the Diversity Institute to challenge our members to aspire to broader diversity, and particularly women with intersecting identities and with various lived experience. So it's great to be here today.
Great, thank you so much. I will pass it to Cheryl. Oh, Cheryl, are you with us? And I don't see Sanjana either, maybe some technical issues. Cheryl?
Hi, apologies everyone, I'm having some connectivity issues. Hi everyone, it's nice to be on a panel and to be able to speak to so many people. My name's Shara Roy. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel at Ernst & Young, and I also sit on EY Canada's Executive Committee. And prior to joining Ernst & Young, I was a lawyer in private practice, a litigator at a firm called Linsner Slatt, and really, while I was in private practice, began to see and understand relatively late, frankly, but to my shame, the issues that were really environmental, that were impacting my own career, that were impacting the careers of others, and decided it was my responsibility to start taking some real tangible steps. So I'm happy to share with some of those with you today.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm not sure if Sanjana will join again, but if so, we'll let her introduce herself. So I do have a couple of questions, and I'll start with Shara. I'm wondering, since joining the challenge is one thing, but I think making a change is another. And I think this is something that individuals have mentioned both in the Q&A and in the chat, is that, you can sign on and that's one thing, but how do you actually make change? How do you actually get diversity on the leadership team and on the boards? And how do you foster that inclusive workplace culture? So what sparked your decision to take up the challenge? What has changed after you joined? And how did your team navigate that change?
So I do firmly believe, as you said, Nancy, that, things that get measured get addressed. And so things like the 50-30 challenge, like the Black North Initiative, making that public commitment not only to thinking about and understanding systemic issues, but actually doing something about them is very important. And I think often we get a lot of pushback, kind of we broadly, about initiatives that are perhaps considered, some sort of metric that you have to meet. And the counter argument is, well, we're going to hire the most qualified person. We're going to promote the most qualified person. This is a meritocracy. And while that's a noble idea, we have to be very conscious of the fact that it's not really the way it works in the real world, and that certain attributes, certain features, in particular, Nancy, you were talking a bit about social networks, career, professional networks, who knows you makes a big difference. And so with these types of challenges, not only does it say externally to our clients, to our people, to prospective hires, we're going to visibly make this change. There's really a component of it where you're held to account. And I think that that's really the important part is, I think over the last 10 years, we've really come around as professionals to the benefit, the idea of why diversity and inclusion is important. And, your website and lots of websites are replete with the stats that say that if you have a more diverse and a more inclusive environment, it helps the bottom line, right? This doesn't have to be an altruistic exercise that you're doing out of the goodness of your heart, although one would hope that there was part of it that would just see the unfairness and want to correct it. But in fact, even if you're just personally motivated, it increases the bottom line. And how can a company, small, medium, large, public, how can a company say that that's not important to them? And so when we measure things, when we say this is what we're committed to, I think that really is the impetus to make it happen and for it to go beyond speech and to go beyond performative to taking actual steps.
Amazing. Makes sense. Yeah. Highlighting that it's the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. Sanjana, I see you popped back in. Did you want to introduce yourself, your organization, and a little bit about your work?
Yes, I am so sorry, folks. Of course, I have technology issues right when I'm supposed to speak, so I apologize. Thanks for bearing with me. Introductions. My name is Sanjana Vijayan. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. My portfolio here at the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce is to really support our membership, primarily small and medium-sized businesses, in the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, as well as work on the Chamber's internal DEI strategies, procedures, and policies as well.
Amazing. Thank you. And I do want to ask about supports for small and medium-sized enterprises. So in your view, should EDI be a priority for SMEs? How can they embed EDI practices within their organizations? And, why was it important for your organization to make this a priority?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many reports around why diversity, equity, and inclusion is a strength for businesses. And as a business association, while there is a moral imperative to do this work, we do lead with the business case. And report after report points to the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion is really good for financial performance of an organization, to improve resiliency, and diverse teams that are supported in inclusive and equitable workplaces tend to be more innovative. They have better engagement among their team. They have better client relationships, and they have access to new markets. So while this is, most reports talk about this, I also want to add a few pieces about the fact that looking at it from a talent perspective, whether it's attracting and retaining top talent in today's economy, it's really important. Small and medium-sized businesses were heavily impacted by COVID-19 and repeated shutdowns. So when we're looking through the lens of COVID recovery as well, inclusion is the pathway ahead. Financial growth. Small and medium-sized businesses, we have to do what we have to do to ensure that we are financially viable. And this is a proven way to do that. The future of businesses is also values-based. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the Sustainable Development Goal 8 is actually around promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So when we're looking forward into what the trends are and how the community and the public is going to look at businesses, we really have to ensure that we're in line with what our customers want from businesses. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is really the path ahead. Just quickly, I will say that a few stats that are like some of my favorites. When a team with one member who shares a client's ethnicity is 152% more likely than another team to understand the client. And something like that is so crucial for a small and medium-sized business because it all comes down to knowing your client. Another piece about demand from customers, more than half of consumers surveyed are more loyal to brands that demonstrate commitment to addressing social inequities in their office. And then to talent attraction, 94% of Gen Zers expect companies to take a stand on important social issues. We're moving to where, we have an aging population, more folks coming into the workforce, and to continue to attract and retain top talent, we need to be more mindful about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensure that our business practices are values aligned.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's so important for attracting and retaining talent, but also reaching consumer values and goals. And we do see that consumer perspectives have shifted and consumers are looking for brands that align with their own values. So those stats are incredible. Thank you. Jennifer, what supports do you think businesses need to extend their EDI efforts, and what tools are available through the challenge that can help?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I think the 50-30 challenge is just a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer for any organization, and it's certainly true for small and medium-sized companies. It not only signals the commitment, regardless of where you're at and where your starting point is, it signals the commitment that it's important to your organization, both for your employees and for your clients. And it has a diversity assessment tool that can be a brilliant guide to assess where you're at and where you want to go. A lot of smaller, medium-sized companies just don't have the resources. It's very limited. And so HR tends to be more of a generalist role if we have it at all. And so that diversity assessment tool can really ask the questions that you may not know to ask. And so really be a great value. It saves time and it saves money, and it allows you to focus on what works, which is exactly, ironically, the name of the toolkit. The What Works Toolkit is an online resource that is designed for Canadian companies looking to adopt or enhance their equity and diversity practices. And it offers a number of concrete tools and resources and helps organizations go beyond just setting out policies and approaches. So if I can just take a moment, there's a couple of tools that I just wanted to bring to people's attention. First, there's a mapping your journey tool that when you join the challenge that you can access, and it actually is an interactive map that helps you as a company to know where you're at and what are the specific ways that you can take your journey forward. There's other tools called Take 10 Actions you can take, Starting the Conversation, a talent processes tool. One of my favorites is a board and leader guidebook, because we also know that board directors and leaders are looking for ways to model inclusive behavior and to create inclusive workspaces where everyone feels that they belong. And there's also a guide to sustaining organizational change, where you can start to adapt your existing systems and structures to be more inclusive and equitable, and start to track and measure progress. And I know a number of people here are asking about that, but tracking and measuring our progress is important. It isn't just about signaling the commitment. And so that's a great way to have support to really understand the way in which you can do that in your organization.
Yeah, love that. I do think that transparency and accountability is super important. And so when you're implementing EDI initiatives, thinking back, and are they working? Are there areas that can be improved? What other areas have we not addressed that still linger? And you had also mentioned small and medium-sized enterprises that require supports because perhaps, if your organization is really small, you may lack capacity in one area, or one functional area of your organization may be serving the purpose of another. And you brought up some excellent tools. I do have a follow-up question for Sanjana, because you support SMEs. Are there particular actions that SMEs can take to really strengthen EDI within the organization? And maybe this is geared towards recruitment, retention, promotion.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, recruitment, retention, and promotion. So to give you some context as well, so when the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce started our diversity, equity, and inclusion program and our supports, we did a lot of focus groups with folks who experience systemic exclusion to varying degrees. And the most common theme across all of the focus groups was that the first barrier and the biggest barrier that people face when interacting with an organization is usually the recruitment or hiring practices. So this is something we always try to highlight with any organization we talk to, is to look at your recruitment practices. So from your job posting, having bias embedded in it. So really try to ensure that you aren't describing gender stereotypes to the way that you're talking about certain roles, to expand your sourcing networks, not only posting it on LinkedIn or Indeed, but finding those job boards for Indigenous employees looking for work. There are settlement agencies who can support you in finding newcomers for your organization. These are really great ways to expand where you're sourcing your applicants so that you end up with a really diverse pool of applicants. And then the other piece is the recruitment. So what about how you're assessing candidates? Are there any arbitrary qualifications that you're looking for that aren't necessary for the job to be performed? So for example, a driver's license or access to a car, are these really needed? And the biggest piece probably, and I'm so glad we're seeing a slow shift towards being transparent about pay right from the start to post how much, that job pays for, and it benefits you, it benefits your applicants as well. A couple other things about recruiting is to not have only panels interviews, so to embed work assessment practices as well. So for example, we heard from particularly persons living with disabilities and say, neurodiverse individuals that they might not be comfortable with panel discussions, but they are completely able to do a skills assessment and truly demonstrate that they are the best person for this job. So not being afraid to, lift the curtain and look at our recruitment practices and see how we might be, setting up barriers for folks to engage with our company or our organization. There's also there's a number of different great tools online, but maybe I'll share one in the chat if I'm able to. But it talks about pay and promotions, not to ask about previous salary history and have applicants name a salary while hiring, because certain individuals do, ask for lower salaries or aren't used to negotiating, and they might then be at a disadvantage. So to have those salary bands set in advance and to have flexible work policies as well. This is really important, particularly to women, to caregivers, to persons living with disabilities. If anything, as a small and medium organization, we have the strength to be as flexible as we're able to be. And often that flexibility allows us to reach a wider group of folks and make them feel, give them space to be included and show up as they are. The other important piece in terms of, just HR policies as a general is to ensure that there's training for all managers or anyone in a leadership position to have proper performance management systems in place, and to ensure that all your managers are trained on anti-oppression, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, so they do understand that our organizations may most likely uphold systemic barriers and what we can do to remove those systemic barriers. So there's a really great resource online that breaks it down step by step on how you can look at your employee evaluations and promotions, your recruitment and hiring process, your pay structures, care and health, like what are the benefits that we're providing to employees, sexual harassment, as well as accountability mechanisms and training for managers. So I'll show that in the chat, but yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
That's so helpful. Thank you. And I really want to highlight one point that you said about flexibility among SMEs. I do think that oftentimes SMEs, because they're smaller, may face capacity issues, but I do think that there is some flexibility there where, you're developing your growth strategy, you're developing your corporate strategy, and you have a real opportunity to embed EDI from the ground up that sometimes larger organizations have to think back because that hasn't been done from the ground up, right? So there's pros and cons, but there is a level of flexibility that small organizations do have for sure. Louis, I see you popped on the line, so we are going to move to Q&A, but I did want to just give everyone, all of our panelists, an opportunity for any parting words of wisdom. So I'll pass it to Shara first, then Jennifer, then Sanjana.
So I would say, I've moved from a law firm that would be considered kind of a medium-sized business to now EY, which is obviously an enormous business with 8,000 people in Canada, and then 250,000, 350,000 worldwide. What I would say is that this doesn't have to be difficult, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Right? Take small steps. At the smaller law firm where I was, where there were about 50 lawyers, about another 150 employees, we did things like name anonymized hiring. And what that helped with, frankly, most of all, was avoiding the managing partner or somebody else coming down the hallway and saying, my neighbor's son needs a job this summer. Well, sorry, your neighbor's son has had all the advantages in life and he still wants a favor to get a job. I'm not sure I want that person working for me, right? So, it's expanding, as Sanjana has said, expanding your pool, looking for the right talent, figuring out what might be a barrier, what might not be a barrier, like a panel discussion. We removed the cocktail hour from our student hiring because the people that did well at the cocktail hour weren't necessarily the best candidates, but that's where they met the senior people at the firm, and the senior people at the firm, after a 5-minute conversation, were like, Bob's terrific. He and I share the same hobby. Let's hire him. Not particularly, qualification for the job. So, the approach that I've been taking to DEI is, it doesn't have to be big or revolutionary. You don't have to change your whole way of thinking or upend your company. Take some small steps. Keep in mind the principles. You're not going to get it perfect. You are going to get it wrong. And being able to admit that, being able to understand that, and come back and refocus, recommit, and then take another step, I think is the best that all of us can do.
Awesome. Thank you. Jennifer, parting words of wisdom.
Yeah, I love all of that. I think it's just a matter of, it is voluntary, but the company either wins or loses. If they want the best and the brightest, and they want the innovation, and they want, the high performance, and then they need to really take a step back and look at how they're bringing people into their organization. And it's an open role starts the moment it's open. The way you name it, the salary you offer it, all of the qualifications, like Sanjana said. So, this is a great opportunity. If you want to join the challenge as well, then you have the guidance that just makes so much sense.
Thank you so much. And Sanjana, final parting words of wisdom.
Yeah, thank you. As you folks might know, I love my stats, and I also work a lot with connecting our small and medium-sized businesses with the settlement sector, so with newcomers. And as we know, we have an influx of newcomers coming to Canada, and oftentimes they're stuck in underemployment or unemployment for a number of years, which comes at a huge cost to all of us, the economy, and to newcomers themselves. So I just want to leave you folks with the fact that, I think Stats Canada did a projection of what the population demographics are going to be. And in 2041, if current trends continue, half of the Canadian population will be newcomers or the Canadian-born children. So we're looking at a really diverse group of folks who are going to be our customers, our clients, our partners, our suppliers, every part of our business. And that is not just for newcomers. We're looking at Indigenous population growing, the percentage of persons living with disabilities, Black Canadians. We're looking at diverse populations really growing. And DEI is the future for businesses. One other thing that I wanted to mention in the hiring and recruitment practices is that when I actually did an interview with a job, one of my favorite practices that they had done, and now I'm trying to get the chamber to adopt, is sharing your interview questions with applicants an hour in advance. This allows them to come prepared, because rarely in our jobs are we asked to speak on the spot or do things on the spot. We have time to prepare, and this allows the interview process to be focused more on the quality, and rather than how people perform when they are highly anxious and stressed. So I'll just leave that as a, as a suggestion if folks want to explore that recruitment process. But Jennifer and Shara, I learned so much from what you folks said as well. So thank you, and thank you, Nancy, for your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will pass it over to Louis.
Well, thank you, panel, and thank you, Nancy. Very informative, lots of great information here. There is one question, and I know there was a previous comment that was answered through a typed response. However, what I'm going to try and do is roll that comment and the one question in together. And really, it's about, there's been many reports written, lots of studies undertaken. So what I'd like to ask then, and maybe Nancy, I'll start with you, and then you can turn it over to some of the panelists as well. So, there are the reports, there are the studies, but how can we actually work effectively to build that organization which breaks down those barriers to inclusivity? And what can we do as leaders, especially in small organizations?
Yeah, and I do think a lot of the panelists have shared some really excellent strategies for change. I do think small organizations, and this is maybe one of the questions, small organizations and building your network. I think it would be important to be networking with other like-minded organizations and really tapping into the resources that are available. So different chambers of commerce, other kind of like networks or conglomerates, so that you can meet other organizations that can share best practices with you. But I'll pass it to any of the panelists who want to answer this question.
Maybe I'll jump in. So a small and medium organization, I think medium-sized organization, it's particularly difficult. I'm happy to see so many attendees, which means that there are people on the line here that are committed and want the tools. I would say that I think it can be very frustrating. And, I oscillate quite often between being very inspired and energized by my DEI work, and then moments where I think, my God, like, how could the UN tell us that it's going to be another 300 years before we reach gender parity? Like, I was hoping it would happen for me in my lifetime. I've got 2 young girls. Like, I can't stand the idea that it's not going to be there for them. And of course, I have a lot of privilege as a white woman coming from a middle-class background, and still I see the struggles. So, I think there's a lot that can be done. What I would say is really the commitment is the main thing, and then the doing. And, what I've seen in organizations, probably kind of on the more medium to large side, is that one person does not diversity make. And really, you need to get to at least 3 people to give individuals the feeling that they're not alone, right? If you're the only woman in the room, if you're the only person of color in the room, if you're the only LGBTQ2+ person in the room, A, it feels like an enormous responsibility. B, it feels precarious. And so, and 2, it can sometimes feel like competition, like, oh, the woman, the other woman this, the other woman that. Once you get to 3, it starts to feel a little bit more secure. And that obviously can be a challenge for small and medium-sized organizations. And so what I would say is, allyship, individual allyship, where you really stand up for that person, where you commit to the goals that you all have. That's probably your best tool. And, having had a look at the toolkits that are available, a lot of those allyships tools are there and available for learning.
Thank you, Shara. What I'd like to do is maybe invite Caitlin to also respond to that question. Caitlin, you on the line?
Great. Yeah. I'm here. I'll turn my camera on. Hi. In terms of leadership, and you might have seen some of the things go in the chat, is the diversity assessment tool is something that can be like more customized to your SME. We're going to be launching it shortly. So if you are interested in learning about a curated resources for your business in terms of some strategies, whether it's leadership or elsewhere, the diversity assessment tool will launch shortly. So I can repost it in the chat. But once again, it's a very curated report that might tell you where you are on your journey and where you should direct yourself in order to get to the next steps on your journey. And I think it's really important for us to think of it as a journey as opposed to a destination, because it's always evolving.
Yeah, and from what I heard, there's a lot of support out there. There's a lot of organizations that are talking about, equity and diversity. There's a lot of organizations that have created tools to help, especially small and medium-sized businesses. because as we heard, they don't have the capacity all the time. So the more we can do to develop tools to help them develop their action plans and their strategies, the more the barriers will come down, the more the diversity will increase, and the more innovation will happen. And what's good about innovation? Innovation drives competitiveness, which means it's good for all of us. It strengthens our communities. So with that, I see the time has elapsed. I just like to thank the panelists. Great job, folks. Great insights. We heard about the barriers to diversity adoption. We heard about those barriers of helping people move into leadership roles. We heard about voluntary codes and challenges, and we heard about best practices. So I hope you gained some insights today on how you can improve your DEI in your own organizations. And please, this is some of the tools that have been posted in the chat there. I think you'll find them very, very helpful. Once again, thank you, panel, and thank all the participants. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.